The December wind cut through the narrow alleyways of Manhattan's Upper East Side with a sharpness that seemed to pierce straight through to the bone. Daniel Brooks pulled his coat tighter as he hurried down the sidewalk, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. The city hummed with its usual evening energy, but there was something different about this particular night. Christmas Eve carried a weight that made even the most hardened New Yorkers pause and reflect. He had been walking home from his shift at the hospital, exhaustion weighing heavy on his shoulders after a particularly grueling day in the emergency department. The familiar route through the quieter residential streets offered a brief respite from the chaos of his medical residency, a chance to decompress before facing another sleepless night of studying. The streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement, and the distant sound of holiday music drifted from apartment windows above. It was then that he heard it, a sound that cut through the ambient noise like a knife, a woman's voice, strained and desperate, calling out for help. Daniel's training kicked in immediately, his fatigue forgotten as he quickened his pace toward the source of the distress. His heart rate elevated as he turned the corner into a dimmer side street, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of trouble. What he found made his blood run cold. A young woman sat crumpled against a brick building, her hand pressed firmly against her forehead where a dark stain was spreading across her fingers. Even in the dim light, Daniel could see the crimson trail running down her temple, stark against her pale skin. She was conscious, but clearly disoriented, her eyes unfocused as she tried to maintain pressure on what appeared to be a significant head wound. Without hesitation, Daniel dropped to his knees beside her, his medical training taking over as he assessed the situation. The woman looked up at him with confusion and fear, her lips trembling not just from the cold but from shock. Her dark hair was matted with blood on one side, and her clothing was disheveled, suggesting she had taken a serious fall. Daniel quickly removed his navy blue wool scarf, the one his mother had knitted for him during his first year of medical school. The fabric was soft but sturdy, and he folded it carefully before applying gentle pressure to the woman's head wound. She winced at the contact but seemed to understand that he was trying to help her. The woman tried to speak, but her words came out fragmented and unclear. Daniel could see that she was struggling to maintain consciousness, her eyelids growing heavy as shock began to set in. He spoke to her in calm, reassuring tones, telling her that everything would be all right, that help was on the way. He used his free hand to call for an ambulance, never taking his eyes off her face as he monitored her condition. As they waited for the paramedics to arrive, Daniel continued to apply pressure to the wound with his scarf, the blue wool gradually darkening as it absorbed the blood. The woman's breathing became more steady, and she seemed to focus on his voice, drawing strength from his presence. He told her his name, hoping to keep her conscious and engaged, but she seemed unable to process the information fully. The ambulance arrived within minutes, and Daniel helped transfer the woman to the paramedics, carefully explaining her condition and the treatment he had provided. As they prepared to transport her to the hospital, one of the paramedics attempted to remove the scarf, but the woman's hand shot up weakly, grasping the fabric with surprising determination. Daniel told them to leave it, understanding that sometimes patients found comfort in holding onto something familiar during traumatic situations. Before the ambulance doors closed, Daniel caught one final glimpse of the woman's face. Despite her injury and disorientation, there was something about her eyes that stayed with him. A depth of intelligence and strength that suggested this was someone who didn't give up easily. The doors slammed shut, and the vehicle disappeared into the night, its red and blue lights fading into the distance. Daniel stood alone on the empty street, his hands still stained with blood, feeling the absence of his scarf around his neck. The cold seemed more intense now, seeping through his coat where the wool had provided warmth just moments before. He realized he didn't even know the woman's name, and the thought troubled him more than he expected. Something about the encounter had affected him profoundly, leaving him with a sense of unfinished business. In the days that followed, Daniel found himself thinking about the injured woman more often than seemed reasonable. He made discreet inquiries at the hospital where he worked, hoping to learn about her condition, but patient privacy laws prevented him from accessing any information. He considered visiting other hospitals in the area, but without knowing her name or any identifying details beyond the circumstances of their meeting, his search seemed hopeless. Years passed, and Daniel completed his residency, eventually establishing himself as a respected emergency physician at Mount Sinai Hospital. The memory of that Christmas Eve encounter never fully faded, though it receded into the background of his increasingly busy professional life. He dated occasionally, but never seriously, often wondering if his inability to commit stemmed from some unconscious comparison to that brief, intense moment of connection with a stranger whose name he never learned. His friends and colleagues frequently tried to set him up on blind dates, convinced that his dedication to his work was preventing him from finding happiness. Daniel usually declined these well-meaning attempts at matchmaking, preferring to focus on his patients and his research. But as he approached his 32nd birthday, the loneliness that he had long suppressed began to feel more acute. It was his colleague Sarah Martinez who finally wore down his resistance. She had been talking about her friend Grace for months, describing her as intelligent, compassionate, and recently returned to New York after completing a graduate program in social work. Sarah insisted that Daniel and Grace would be perfect for each other, sharing similar values and a dedication to helping others. After weeks of persistent encouragement, Daniel finally agreed to meet Grace for dinner at a quiet Italian restaurant in the village. He felt nervous in a way that surprised him, having grown comfortable with his solitary existence over the past few years. As he adjusted his tie in the mirror before leaving his apartment, he wondered what had possessed him to agree to this arrangement. The restaurant was small and intimate, with exposed brick walls and soft lighting that created an atmosphere of warmth and privacy. Daniel arrived a few minutes early and was seated at a table near the back, where he could observe the entrance while reviewing the menu. He found himself fidgeting with his napkin, unable to remember the last time he had felt this anxious about meeting someone new. When Grace Whitmore walked through the restaurant's front door, Daniel felt something shift in his chest, though he couldn't immediately identify why. She was beautiful, certainly, with long, dark hair that caught the light as she moved, and an elegance in her bearing that suggested both confidence and grace. But there was something else, something familiar about her presence that made him sit up straighter in his chair. Grace spoke briefly with the hostess, and Daniel watched as she scanned the dining room, clearly looking for someone she had never met. When their eyes met across the crowded restaurant, he felt a jolt of recognition that he couldn't quite place. She smiled and began walking toward his table, and with each step, the feeling of familiarity grew stronger. As Grace approached, Daniel stood to greet her, his mind racing to understand why she seemed so familiar. She extended her hand with a warm smile, introducing herself, and as they shook hands, he noticed something that made his breath catch in his throat. Around her neck, partially hidden beneath her blouse, was a piece of navy blue fabric, wool, with a distinctive cable-knit pattern that he recognized instantly. Daniel stared at the fabric for a moment too long, his composure faltering as the realization began to dawn on him. Grace noticed his attention and touched the scarf self-consciously, her own expression changing as she looked more closely at his face. For several long seconds they stood frozen beside the restaurant table, each struggling to process what seemed impossible. Grace's hand moved to cover the scarf completely, and Daniel could see the exact moment when recognition flashed in her eyes. Her face went pale, and she took a small step backward, her lips parting as if to speak but no words emerging. The bustling restaurant seemed to fade around them as they stared at each other, the weight of their shared memory settling between them like a physical presence. Finally, Grace found her voice, though it came out barely above a whisper. She spoke his name, the same name he had given her that night 3 years ago, and Daniel felt his heart rate accelerate as if he were experiencing that emergency all over again. She remembered him, despite her head injury and the chaos of that night. Somehow she had held on to the memory of his face, his voice, his name. Daniel nodded slowly, still struggling to believe what was happening. He gestured toward the chair across from him, and Grace sat down carefully, as if moving too quickly might shatter the surreal nature of their reunion. They continued to stare at each other across the small table, both overwhelmed by the impossibility of this coincidence. Grace's hand remained at her throat, protecting the piece of his scarf that she wore like a talisman. Daniel could see that the fabric had been carefully preserved, the edges hemmed to prevent fraying, the wool still holding its original color despite the years. She had kept it close to her heart all this time, a reminder of the stranger who had saved her life on Christmas Eve. As the initial shock began to wear off, Grace started to speak in halting sentences about what had happened to her that night. She had been walking home from a holiday party when she slipped on a patch of black ice, striking her head against the corner of a building with enough force to cause a serious concussion. She remembered very little of the incident itself, but she had never forgotten the face of the man who had helped her, the gentle authority in his voice, as he assured her that everything would be all right. Daniel listened intently as Grace described her recovery, how she had spent weeks in the hospital dealing with complications from her head injury. The doctors had been concerned about potential brain damage, and her memory of the period immediately following the accident remained spotty. But throughout her recovery, she had held onto his scarf, the only tangible connection to the person who had likely saved her life. Grace explained that she had tried to find him in the months following her accident, visiting the area where they had met and asking questions of anyone who might have seen something that night. She had even contacted local hospitals, hoping that someone might recognize her description of her rescuer. But her search had yielded no results, and eventually she had been forced to accept that she might never see him again. Daniel found himself deeply moved by her dedication to finding him, touched that their brief encounter had meant as much to her as it had to him. He told her about his own attempts to learn about her condition, how frustrated he had been by his inability to follow up on her recovery. The coincidence of their meeting now, arranged by mutual friends who had no knowledge of their previous connection, seemed almost too remarkable to be real. As they talked, Daniel noticed how Grace unconsciously touched the scarf whenever their conversation turned to that night, as if drawing strength from its presence. He could see that wearing it had become a habit, a ritual that connected her to a moment when she had felt completely vulnerable and dependent on the kindness of a stranger. The realization that she had carried this piece of him with her for 3 years filled him with an emotion he struggled to name. Grace described how the accident had changed her life in unexpected ways, leading her to pursue social work as a career. The experience of being helped by a stranger had awakened in her a desire to help others who found themselves in desperate situations. She had specialized in crisis intervention, working with people who had experienced trauma or were in immediate danger. Daniel shared his own journey through medical school and residency, how that Christmas Eve encounter had reinforced his commitment to emergency medicine. He had often thought about her during particularly difficult cases, remembering how it felt to be the only thing standing between someone and serious harm. Her face had become a symbol for him of why his work mattered, even when the hours were long and the emotional toll was high. As the evening progressed, they discovered numerous other connections beyond their shared traumatic experience. Both had grown up in small towns before moving to New York. Both had lost parents at relatively young ages. Both had chosen careers focused on helping others through their worst moments. The conversation flowed naturally between them, punctuated by moments of wonder at how their paths had intersected in such an unexpected way. Grace spoke about her work with domestic violence survivors, how she had learned to recognize the signs of trauma and help people rebuild their sense of safety in the world. Her own experience of vulnerability had given her insights into what her clients needed, allowing her to connect with them on a level that went beyond professional training. Daniel described his work in the emergency department, the split-second decisions that could mean the difference between life and death, the weight of responsibility that came with being someone's last hope. He talked about the patients who stayed with him long after their treatment was complete, how certain cases had shaped his understanding of human resilience and fragility. As they shared their stories, both began to understand that their Christmas Eve meeting had been more than just a random encounter between strangers. It had been a defining moment for both of them, shaping their career choices and their understanding of what it meant to care for others. The scarf that Grace wore had become a symbol not just of their connection, but of their shared commitment to being there for people in their darkest moments. The restaurant began to empty around them as the evening grew later, but neither Daniel nor Grace seemed ready for their conversation to end. They had ordered dinner at some point, but their plates sat largely untouched as they continued to explore the remarkable circumstances that had brought them together again. Grace pulled the scarf slightly away from her neck, revealing more of the navy blue fabric that had absorbed her blood that night. Daniel could see where it had been carefully cleaned and mended, the repairs invisible unless you knew what to look for. She had treasured this piece of cloth, this connection to a moment when someone had cared for her without expecting anything in return. Daniel reached across the table and touched the edge of the scarf gently, feeling the familiar texture of the wool his mother had chosen with such care years ago. Grace didn't pull away, instead watching his face as he examined the fabric that had traveled such an unexpected journey. In that moment, touching the scarf felt like touching the thread that connected their past to their present. Grace told him about the time she had worn the scarf when she needed courage, how it had become her talisman during difficult periods of her recovery and throughout her graduate studies. She had worn it to job interviews, to court hearings where she advocated for her clients, to family gatherings where she had to explain her career change to relatives who didn't understand her motivations. Daniel was deeply touched by the role his small act of kindness had played in her life, how something he had done instinctively had become a source of strength for her over the years. He had given up his scarf that night without a second thought, focused entirely on stopping her bleeding and getting her the medical attention she needed. To learn that it had meant so much to her filled him with a profound sense of gratitude. As they prepared to leave the restaurant, neither wanted to end this miraculous evening. They had found each other again, against impossible odds, and the prospect of saying goodbye felt premature, given the significance of their reunion. Grace suggested they walk through the nearby park, despite the late hour and the December chill in the air. The park was quiet and peaceful, decorated with holiday lights that cast a warm glow over the pathways. They walked slowly, neither eager to reach any particular destination, both savoring the unexpected gift of this time together. Daniel noticed that Grace continued to touch the scarf periodically, as if reassuring herself that this was really happening. They found a bench near a small pond where ducks floated peacefully, despite the cold weather. Sitting beside each other, they could feel the weight of all the unspoken emotions between them. Gratitude, wonder, and something deeper that neither was quite ready to name. The scarf was visible now, draped around Grace's neck like a bridge connecting their past and present. Grace spoke about the guilt she had carried for never properly thanking him. How many nights she had lain awake, wishing she could tell him what his kindness had meant to her. Daniel assured her that no thanks were necessary, that helping her had been the most natural thing in the world. But he understood her need to express her gratitude, just as he had needed to know that she had recovered from her injuries. Daniel asked if he could see the scarf more closely, and Grace carefully unwound it from around her neck, handling it with the reverence reserved for sacred objects. She placed it in his hands, and he examined the fabric that had become such an important part of both their stories. The wool was slightly thinner now, softened by years of wear and careful washing, but the cable knit pattern was still clearly visible. Holding the scarf, Daniel could almost transport himself back to that snowy Christmas Eve, remembering the weight of responsibility he had felt as he applied pressure to Grace's wound. He had been so focused on her immediate medical needs that he hadn't allowed himself to truly see her as a person, someone with hopes and dreams and a future that hung in the balance of those crucial minutes. Grace watched his face as he held the scarf, seeing the emotions play across his features as he remembered that night. She told him about waking up in the hospital days later, how confused and frightened she had been until a nurse had brought her the scarf, explaining that the paramedics had found her clutching it during transport. From that moment, it had become her most precious possession. Daniel carefully wound the scarf around Grace's neck again, his fingers brushing against her skin as he adjusted the fabric. The simple act felt intimate and profound, like a ceremony marking their reunion. Grace's eyes remained fixed on his face throughout, and he could see tears forming at the corners, though she was smiling. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, both processing the extraordinary nature of their meeting. The park around them was peaceful and still, as if the world had paused to allow them this moment of connection. Daniel found himself studying Grace's face, noting the small scar near her hairline that marked where she had struck the building that night, a permanent reminder of their first encounter. Grace spoke about her dreams during the months following her accident, how Daniel's face had appeared to her repeatedly, always offering comfort and reassurance. She had wondered if she was idealizing a stranger, creating a hero figure to help her process her trauma. But seeing him again, she realized that her memories had been accurate. He possessed the same gentle strength that had sustained her through her recovery. Daniel shared his own recurring thoughts about that night, how he had questioned whether he had done enough to help her, whether she had received proper treatment at the hospital. The uncertainty had troubled him for years, creating a sense of unfinished responsibility that he had never been able to resolve. As they prepared to leave the park, Grace asked if Daniel would like to have the scarf back, offering to return the item that rightfully belonged to him. But Daniel shook his head, explaining that it had found its proper home with her. The scarf had become part of her story, part of her healing, and he couldn't imagine it anywhere else. Grace smiled at his response, her hand moving once again to touch the fabric at her throat. She told him that she would treasure it even more now, knowing that its original owner understood and approved of the role it had played in her life. The scarf had become a symbol of hope and human kindness, and sharing its story with Daniel had made it even more precious to her. They exchanged contact information as they left the park, both eager to continue their conversation in the days to come. The evening had been transformative for both of them, revealing connections and coincidences that seemed to suggest some greater purpose at work in their lives. Daniel walked Grace to her apartment, a brownstone in Greenwich Village that she shared with a roommate who was mercifully asleep when they arrived. They stood on the front steps for a long moment, neither ready to end this remarkable evening. Grace thanked him again for saving her life, and Daniel thanked her for preserving his scarf and the memory of their meeting. As Grace disappeared into her building, Daniel remained on the sidewalk for several minutes, looking up at the windows and trying to process everything that had happened. The evening had begun as a routine blind date arranged by well-meaning friends, But it had become something far more significant, a reunion with someone who had unknowingly influenced the course of his life. Walking home through the quiet streets, Daniel reflected on the role that chance and choice played in human connections. If Grace hadn't slipped on that patch of ice, if he hadn't chosen to walk home through that particular neighborhood, if Sarah hadn't been persistent about setting them up, any one of these factors could have prevented their paths from crossing again. But they had found each other, against all odds, and Daniel felt a sense of completion that he hadn't realized he was missing. The woman whose face had haunted his dreams was real. She was healthy, she was thriving, and somehow she had become part of his life again. The scarf that had bound their fates together on that Christmas Eve continued to connect them, a tangible reminder of the mysterious ways that lives could intertwine. In the days that followed their dinner, Daniel and Grace began to spend time together regularly. They discovered that their initial attraction went far beyond their shared history, that they genuinely enjoyed each other's company and shared similar values and interests. Grace continued to wear the scarf, and Daniel found comfort in seeing this piece of his past integrated into their present. They talked openly about their work, sharing stories of particularly challenging cases and supporting each other through the emotional demands of their respective careers. Daniel found that Grace's insights into trauma and recovery enhanced his understanding of his own patients, while Grace appreciated Daniel's medical perspective on the physical aspects of the injuries and illnesses that affected her clients. Their relationship developed slowly and naturally, built on a foundation of mutual respect and understanding that had been established during their first encounter years before. They had already seen each other in moments of vulnerability and crisis, and this shared experience created a level of trust that typically took much longer to develop. Grace introduced Daniel to her colleagues and friends, sharing the story of how they had met with obvious pride and wonder. Daniel did the same, and their friends were amazed by the coincidence that had brought them together. Sarah Martinez was particularly delighted to learn that her matchmaking efforts had reunited two people who had already saved each other's lives. As winter turned to spring, Daniel and Grace's relationship deepened into something profound and lasting. They had found in each other not just romantic partners, but kindred spirits who understood the importance of being present for others in their darkest moments. The scarf that Grace continued to wear had become a symbol not just of their initial meeting, but of their ongoing commitment to caring for each other and for those around them. On Christmas Eve, exactly 4 years after their first meeting, Daniel and Grace returned to the spot where he had found her bleeding and afraid. The street looked different in daylight, less threatening and more ordinary, but they could both feel the significance of the location. Grace touched the scarf around her neck as they stood where their lives had first intersected, grateful for the chain of events that had led them to this moment. Daniel took Grace's hand as they stood together on the sidewalk, both understanding that they were marking not just an anniversary, but a transformation. What had begun as a moment of crisis had become the foundation for a love story that neither could have imagined. The scarf around Grace's neck was no longer just a reminder of her vulnerability, but a symbol of the strength that could emerge from accepting help from others. As they prepared to leave the street where their story had begun, Grace unwound the scarf from around her neck and draped it carefully around both their shoulders, creating a connection that encompassed them both. In that moment, the fabric that had once been used to stop bleeding had become a symbol of the healing power of human connection, the way that one person's kindness could ripple forward through time to create something beautiful and lasting. They walked away from that meaningful street together, the scarf now connecting them both in a gesture that felt like a promise. The winter air carried the scent of snow, and Grace leaned closer to Daniel as they made their way toward the warmth of a nearby cafe. Inside the small coffee shop, they found a corner table where they could speak privately. Daniel reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small velvet box, his hands trembling slightly as he placed it on the table between them. Grace's eyes widened as she realized what was happening, her fingers instinctively moving to touch the scarf that had brought them together. Daniel spoke softly about how that Christmas Eve night had changed everything for him, how finding her again had felt like discovering a missing piece of himself. He told her that the scarf had always been meant to connect them, that some threads were too strong to be broken by time or circumstance. Grace's tears fell freely as Daniel opened the box to reveal a simple but elegant ring. She whispered yes before he could even finish asking the question, understanding that their love story had been written in that moment 3 years ago, when he had wrapped his scarf around her wound. As Daniel slipped the ring onto her finger, Grace carefully unwound the navy blue scarf and draped it around both their shoulders once more. The wool that had once absorbed her blood now witnessed their promise to care for each other through whatever challenges life might bring. They sat together in the quiet cafe, planning a future built on the foundation of that extraordinary Christmas Eve encounter. The scarf remained around both their shoulders, a tangible reminder that sometimes the most meaningful connections begin in moments of crisis, when strangers choose to become guardians angels for one another. Outside, snow began to fall gently on the streets of New York, covering the city in a blanket of white that made everything seem new and full of possibility. Daniel and Grace held hands across the small table, their lives now permanently intertwined by love and the mysterious wisdom of a worn blue scarf that had always known they belonged together.